Iono, at your service. You're a fantasy reenactor and you're just starting out. Should you get yourself a set of Vambraces? In today's video, I'll be trying my best to answer that question. If your garb is for cosplay, the answer is simple. If you're portraying a character who wears Vambraces, you wear Vambraces. Although fantasy reenactment, when your garb is designed to fit in with a fantasy world of your choosing, while still being functional and practical in the real world, and the character you're portraying is of your own design, the decision is no longer made for you. So the question is, are Vambraces a good idea for you? Or rather, are Vambraces practical in the real world? You might have noticed that I'm sometimes wearing them and sometimes not. Admittedly, sometimes the logic is just that I thought they would look cool on camera, or that I lost them, or that I couldn't be bothered to tie them. But most of the time, that's because there are a whole host of advantages and disadvantages to wearing them. And like most clothing and garb, they don't make sense all of the time. Let's start with the disadvantages. They can be hot and they can be sweaty, and they add weight to your kit. If any of you are modern gram counting backpackers, you'll understand the issue with this. If you add weight to your kit, it makes it harder to travel, harder to walk, it means that you use more energy going uphill, etc. And of course, they add weight to the ends of your arms. Now, because of leverage, if you add weight to the ends of your arms, it significantly affects the speed that you can move your arms, especially if the Vambraces are heavy, like steel or hardened leather. So it actually changes the agility in fighting, which could be why certain warriors throughout history, like Scottish Highlanders and Picts, generally opted not to wear much armour, because armour slows you down. And if armour slows you down, you can't be quite as nimble in a fight, which means that you don't have the advantage of being able to move faster than the other guy. Adding Vambraces to the ends of your arms is actually probably one of the worst things that you can add weight to, because if you were wearing shoulder armour, your torso doesn't move much whilst you're fighting, so you don't have to overcome the inertia of that, whereas if you're adding Vambraces, you have to overcome the inertia of the extra weight of the Vambraces with every sword swing that you do. So you're going to change how easy it is to move and how fast you are in battle and in combat. They are not historically accurate, as far as I know, unless you're using one on one arm for archery, or you're using them as cuffs with chainmail, or you're using them as part of full armour. But I can be honest, fantasy reenactment, the historically accurateness of an item isn't really our main concern, but the usefulness of it is certainly a concern. They take extra time to put on. I mean, you have to tie knots, you have to feed them over the sleeves of your clothing if you're wearing long sleeves, you have to remember where they are, you have to remember to bring them. They just make getting dressed slower, which, I mean, for costumes isn't that much of a concern, but if you were putting on this garb every day of your life, it might matter. They can be uncomfortable. That is most of the time a problem with a set of Vambraces that are bought at a convention, because generally the insides of them can be quite scratchy, and of course they can be poorly fitting. I often find that if I buy Vambraces cheap on the internet, on Amazon or eBay or something, that they taper too much for my arms, and they taper too much for most people's arms, which means that they're either tight at the front and baggy at the back, etc. And also, there's a costume seller's habit of making them out of vinyl leather. Vinyl leather doesn't breathe at all, so that really is uncomfortable, especially at a medieval fair in the heat of summer. And now it's time for the advantages. They help identify a garb as being fantasy in origin rather than historical, because they aren't historically accurate. So anyone who knows what they're talking about, if they see somebody dressed like I am, it ought to look much more fantastical than historical. Whereas if I was just wearing the tunic and the wool surcoat and the hood, and I was wearing no Vambraces, it's fairly historical garb really. I could easily be mistaken for a Viking or a Celt, etc., especially with my plaid cloak. They function as armour. They add protection. If you're not wearing it with a full suit of armour, or chainmail or something, then that much protection isn't really particularly significant. But it is still protection, and quite a large number of strikes are actually on the ends of your arms. If you're wearing long chainmail, they prevent the sleeves from swinging. That's actually a significant factor, because long sleeve chainmail, the sleeve is actually very heavy, and it's going to be quite loose on the ends of your arms because of the nature of how chainmail hangs. So it's actually very difficult to move if the chainmail is swinging around all over the place, which is why typically if you see somebody wearing mail, they'll have cuffs or vambraces over the ends of the arms, and they'll have a belt. And that was done historically because you see it in drawings. I'll try to find one somewhere. They protect your arms from string slap in archery, albeit not when they're worn the way round I have them worn, with the thick flat bit on the outside of my arm, but if I have them worn like that, it's an archery arm guard, just like you normally see archers wearing, although modern archers tend to wear ones made out of plastic with holes in or carbon fibre. In rough weather conditions, they help keep your arms dry and warm. Now you've got to remember that although it's only the lower section of your arm, but if you're using a cloak to keep dry, like that, and you're holding a stick or a weapon, then the end of your arm is what pokes out of the cloak. So having something waterproof on that section of your arm, it will keep your sleeves dry, and it also stops the wind from blowing up your sleeves. So honestly, it makes quite a big difference to warmth, especially in the winter and in the wind and in the rain. And if you wear gloves or mittens over them, then it makes a very big difference. It's well worth doing. They look awesome. Of course, that's subject to opinion. I like them, you can tell, otherwise I wouldn't be wearing them. And of course, if you're wearing one on one arm for archery, you might want to wear one on both arms just for the symmetry of the garb, because people are generally accustomed to seeing one on each arm in fantasy clothing. So now we've looked at the advantages and disadvantages. Are vambraces practical in the real world? Now, on first thoughts, I was tempted to say no, because generally things that are practical in the real world were actually done or are actually done in the modern world. Really, even cloaks are worn in the modern world, it's just called a poncho nowadays. But on the other hand, I think in some situations they do actually make sense. If you're an archer, you should be wearing one on one arm for safety, at least while shooting, unless you're absolutely certain that your technique is such that you never get string slap, because string slap with a high poundage bow can actually do quite a lot of damage, and I know this from experience from having not bothered to wear an arm guard on unfortunate occasions. And even if you're sure your technique is good enough, if you're wearing a long sleeve baggy tunic, you may want to wear vambraces anyway, just to keep the fabric out of the way of the string. If your character spends a lot of time in combat, you might want to wear them as armour. Although, if this is the case and you're in a specifically hot climate, there's a good chance that when you're on the road, you would have them in your kit or in your pack, and that you would only put them on if you were expecting trouble. And you probably wouldn't wear them all the time. If your climate is cold, wet or windy, then they do make quite a lot of sense for reasons mentioned before. And of course, if like here in the UK you get quite hot summers and quite cold, wet, windy winters, then you might want to consider having a set with your garb to wear some of the time, depending on the weather. So, I guess that my final conclusion for this video is they can be useful. But like most items of clothing and gear, they don't make sense all of the time. But then most of the time, if you like them, they don't cause much of a problem. So if you like them because they look cool, then, you know, wear them most of the time, just not in the hottest summer, and you'll probably be okay. And then on the other side of the argument, that works too. If you're somebody who specifically doesn't like them, then not wearing them doesn't cause much of a problem most of the time. So don't wear them. Go for it. So, whether you should or shouldn't wear them, now that's covered, is there any specific preference on the type of vambrace? If you're intending to use them because they look cool, or to keep your arms warm or dry, then all you're going to need is a thin piece of leather. You don't need them to be specifically heavy, because they're not intended for protection, it's just clothing, so it hasn't really got to be any more sturdy than a leather jacket. Obviously in this situation, the more breathable they are, the more comfortable they're going to be. So certain types of leather are more breathable than others. I've heard that brain tan is one of the best, but I can't get that in the UK, so mine are just plain and simple chrome tanned upholstery leather. But leather is always better than leather alternatives like vinyl and PU leather, so bear that in mind. The simple upholstery leather you can usually get as seconds from upholstery companies, and you can usually get it quite cheap. And of course, if you can't find it as seconds, cut up a charity shop leather jacket or raid the tip for cushions off an old leather sofa, that works too. Now, for armour, obviously thicker and more stiff alternatives work better, but the thicker and more stiff you make it, the heavier it is, which comes with its own disadvantages, as mentioned earlier. Thick hardened leather is good, it'll protect you from blunt impact, but it won't really turn a blade. Or at least, it won't turn a blade more than once, depending on the speed of impact, angle of cut, type of blade, etc. But hardened leather isn't really effective enough against a bladed weapon to rely on, so that's probably a point worth considering. You could always rivet strips of steel onto it or something like that to improve its effectivity if you really wanted to go with hardened leather, because hardened leather is lighter than the steel alternative. And of course, steel will always offer much better protection because that will turn a blade, but it's much more heavy, so the choice is yours. For archery, well, you want them to be quite thin for comfort. Now these are made for archery, but if I was doing archery I would wear the one on my left hand, spun round that way. And as you can see, I've got a thicker piece of leather, which is made up of two pieces of leather the same thickness sewn together, on the front to offer a little bit more protection from the string. And of course, if you're wearing two for symmetry during archery, then the one on your right arm, or your left depending on which handed you are shooting, needs to be thin and short enough so that when you bend your arm back it doesn't get in the way at your elbow. I'll demonstrate using my hardened leather ones what that looks like. It makes it very difficult to shoot. As you can see, I'm now wearing my hardened leather braces. Now when I made these, I did make them with the intention of doing archery. So this one has a smooth face on it and this one has metal on it. If there was metal on both of them, then obviously when the string comes towards my arm, then if it did hit my arm, then the metal would wear out the string. Now these were the first set of braces that I made, so I hadn't quite perfected the design yet. The main problem with this is in the comfortable position where it's sort of centred and not touching my wrist, then if I move my arm like that, it actually pushes this end towards my hand. Because they're hardened leather, that pushing against my wrist is actually very uncomfortable. When you draw a bow, the position is exactly that. So that actually affects my draw, so my arm is in a slightly different place to what it would be if I wasn't wearing that, which means when I shoot, the arrows end up in a slightly different place because my anchor point is different and my posture is different. So although I can shoot, it's not ideal. If I was going to change these, I would make this one slightly shorter on the back, but then still keep the length on the front so that there was enough room for my arm to bend without it pushing the position of the bracer. I didn't catch that on camera, but that was too good not to show you the results of. I've just shot 6 arrows, all from being stood in exactly the same place, at exactly the same range, with exactly the same reference point, and the only thing I changed between each group of 3 was whether I was wearing this or not. So that actually makes quite a large difference to my aim. There's about a hand's width or 6 inches in between the 2 distinct separate groupings. So that's about it. I think I've covered everything, or everything I could think of anyway. I'm sure you viewers have other reasons why you either like or don't like vambraces, and other advantages and disadvantages to wear them, so please let me know about those in the comments. and I'll see you in the next video.